interesting war is heating up in Washington as the debate over wireless spectrum continues. The issue is spectrum is running out as subscribers and data usage are growing rapidly. There are currently bills in both the House and the Senate that focus on freeing up more spectrum, but the debate comes in with what role the FCC would play in distributing it. And what's more is if policymakers fail to act, the U.S. economy and users could be at serious risk. So to help us better understand the situation and what can be done to solve it, we're going to bring in Bruce Mehlman, the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Tech Policy and the co-chair of the Internet Innovation Alliance. Thanks for talking with us, Bruce.
Thank you for having me today.
You're very welcome. Well, first of all, let's just talk about the near capacity state that the wireless networks are facing. What is going on here?
You know, the challenge fundamentally is a really exciting and positive one. Over the last decade or two, we've seen extraordinary advances in computing power, extraordinary advances in storage, and extraordinary advances in connectivity. What that means is where there was fundamentally no global internet 2 decades ago, there's now 2 billion people around the planet on the internet. And similarly, whereas perhaps a decade or two ago, the only video people might watch would be what was on regular TV, now people are uploading YouTube videos all the time from their smartphones, from various devices that they may have. There's a real exciting opportunity for everybody to be a content creator. Photos, for example. Entities, social media like Facebook, opportunities like Google Plus have meant there is an explosion of content. And we're in this exciting arms race where the creation of content is happening so fast, it's exceeding even these amazing improvements in computing power, these amazing improvements in storage capacity, and particularly these amazing improvements in connectivity. And so what you're finding is, even as smartphones get more and more powerful and can do more and more things, you're more likely to find congestion on your smartphone network because everybody else is uploading videos and photos too.
Right. Well, now the legislation that is in Congress, what would it do?
So the first thing that's happening, as we described, is the combination of technological and social. More people are using more powerful devices to create more content. That's creating congestion on the networks. At the same time, policymakers are trying to understand two things. How do they help resolve the congestion on the network? And policymakers always want to create jobs and competition wherever they can. Now, one of the reasons we have congestion on the network is because the policymakers who were there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, all kept trying to do what they thought was smart at the time. And so for the whole history of the Federal Communications Commission, and the history of spectrum, policymakers have tried to decide how they thought spectrum should be used, who should get it, who shouldn't get it. For example, broadcasters many decades ago got lots of spectrum for which they didn't have to pay anything at the time because policymakers knew then that the most valuable use of that spectrum would be broadcast TV. Right. We've had a digital television revolution. That spectrum is now woefully underutilized, and policymakers realize that if they get the spectrum in the hands of people who are providing high-speed connectivity, it would provide much greater use. And so the question is, how do you take spectrum from a poor use based on old government rules saying who couldn't use it, who couldn't use it, and how they couldn't use it, and we want to get it into the market's hands to decide what the best possible use of it is.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the legislation, the FCC opposes it. Why is this?
So within the context where everybody agrees, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, industry at all levels, everybody agrees we need more spectrum to help deal with this explosion of content so that more people can use it. There are different approaches. What the FCC says is the FCC, would like to retain the power to decide who is and isn't appropriate to be in a spectrum auction, who is worthy of getting it, and who they may think already has enough spectrum. In the House of Representatives, what the majority is saying is government allocations, government limitations on spectrum got us into this mess. The reason that we don't have the spectrum efficiently allocated is because government has always been deciding who can use it, who can't use it, who can transfer it, who can't transfer it. So what the House of Representatives said is this time let's let the market decide. Let's have an auction. Anybody who wants to apply to win the auction ought to be allowed to apply to win the auction. What the FCC says is we want to retain the authority to not let certain people bid in the auction. For example, if we decide some carriers have more spectrum than we think they should have, or if we decide that people have a lot of market share in a certain area, we the FCC might want to limit who can bid in the auction. In the House of Representatives, what the majority says is, well, if you limit who can bid in the auction, that means less revenue for taxpayers. That means less market allocation of this resource, and all previous efforts to limit who could or couldn't bid in auctions or who couldn't own spectrum have consistently led to spectrum crunches. Why don't we let the market have a shot? Let folks buy the spectrum and bid for the spectrum, and the market will allocate the spectrum most efficiently.
Right, and in an op-ed piece, you brought up the irony involved, saying, quote, "The FCC, of course, objects to congressional micromanagement of their micromanagement, seeking maximum flexibility to set auction rules," end quote. So can you explain this further for us?
It's welcome to Washington in many ways. 2012, the House Majority's Telecommunications Committee and members say, hey, our proposal is everybody should be allowed to bid in the auction. You, FCC, want to limit who can and can't bid based on whatever your criterion may be at the moment. The FCC, so that's the House saying to the FCC, we're going to not let you micromanage this auction. We're going to let everybody bid. The FCC says putting those kind of restrictions on how we set up the auction is you, House of Representatives, micromanaging us, the FCC, in doing our job of setting up the auctions. Both sides have a legitimate claim that either the Congress or the FCC is trying to limit the other. Again, it probably comes down to, since everybody agrees there's a spectrum crunch, and I think most people would concede the reason there's inefficient use of spectrum is because of old government decisions on who could and could not use spectrum. Logically, you want less government constraints in the future on who can and can't bid for, use, or aggregate spectrum would be the logical way to fix the problem of the past, government constraints leading to insufficient spectrum.
The FCC says that it wants to increase competition, but what about its actions indicate otherwise?
Well, whether it's taking a look at previous auctions where the FCC set rules to advance policies that a lot of folks didn't think there was a marketplace need for, in what's so-called C-block auctions of a couple of years ago, the FCC set limits on how that spectrum could be used, less bidders bid, less money was raised, so that's one example. Recently, in taking a look at a proposal between two telecom carriers, AT&T and T-Mobile, to combine, the FCC said, you know what, we think there ought to be more carriers so that while we care about a spectrum crunch, and this combination of the two players is a very intelligent way to combine spectrum assets, reduce congestion, serve more bandwidth to most consumers, because 90% of consumers in the marketplace right now, according to the FCC, have at least 5 choices of spectrum, but also get to some of these rural areas where nobody's building and where you have one combined AT&T and T-Mobile, they have more resources to deploy to areas that right now aren't being served because everybody's busy competing in that 90%.
So if the FCC gets its way, do you think it would greatly limit competition in the mobile marketplace?
You know, we've got a terrifically competitive mobile marketplace right now. So that's the good news. I think the biggest challenge is if the FCC gets its way and follows through with what many in the House fear they might do, which is limit who's allowed to compete. I think the very spectrum crunch that these auctions are intended to alleviate doesn't get alleviated effectively, and that industry and policymakers are more quickly back to the FCC saying everything we thought we knew about the marketplace needs in 2012 by 2015 may be unlearned. Having everybody eligible to acquire the spectrum and to possibly to subsequently sell the spectrum to a higher and better user is letting the market allocate the spectrum. If we had done that the first time around, we would have less congestion, we'd have more high-speed wireless, and I think we'd have the same amount of competition. I do believe those who worry that there'll be 1 or 2 players who gobble up all the spectrum and then sit on it are missing the reality of what's happening, where the folks right now, the folks with the most spectrum are barely able to serve enough spectrum for all of the exciting uses people want. We don't have a problem of lack of competition. We have a problem of lack of investment. We have a problem of lack of spectrum aggregation to meet the marketplace needs.
So what would the open auctions that the legislation calls for do for users and the U.S. economy?
I think auctioning the spectrum from the current inefficient use that's not broadband based to allowing a more efficient, to allowing a broadband base alone would be beneficial. I think if you narrow the auctions, what you'll have is you'll raise less revenue for the Treasury at a time when certainly we need to raise more revenue for the Treasury. And you will potentially limit the opportunities for the folks who are proving most successful with consumers, who are offering folks what they want, who are being most innovative, if you take them out of it, if you say we only want an auction among other players, the marketplace rewards folks to date who offer innovative services, who offer competitive opportunities, who make the best use of their spectrum. Taking away the folks who have been doing that most effectively will probably limit how that spectrum is used. I get that policymakers would love to get a blank piece of paper and say, we want X number of competitors to have X number of market share, to each innovate each year something different. It's not the way the market works. You can't predict innovation. You can't predict where technology is going. You can't predict where consumers are going to go. So logically, you ought to have auction rules that don't try to predict, auction rules that give the most freedom to the marketplace.
So what is the answer then?
Well, I certainly believe, the Internet Innovation Alliance believes, that the best answer here is to give the most flexibility to the marketplace. Auction rules that don't limit who can and can't bid, that don't limit what can be done with the spectrum. The government authorities still have a variety of tools they can use. So if in the end we start seeing spectrum warehousing, people having more spectrum than they ever possibly need and not making use of it, which we're not seeing today, if that were a future outcome, there are plenty of tools policymakers can use to address it. But since the problems that we're in now are the result of previous policymakers trying to limit who can and can't use, who can and can't buy, and how they can and can't use it, I would suggest the smartest thing you can do is, for these next auctions, take away those limits. And if we ended up with a problem that some folks are worried about, we could address it then. For now, the problem is the folks providing the most innovative solutions don't have enough spectrum to keep up with all of this awesome user-generated content and these amazing technological possibilities that innovations allow.
Right. Well, Google's Washington Managing Counsel Rick Whitt recently said that auctions would not eliminate the spectrum crunch. So what's your response to this?
Well, God knows Google's creating so much content so fast, and users of the internet, all services. Yahoo's doing some exciting stuff. My BlackBerry, you can have to pry out of my cold, dead hands. I mean, everybody with smartphones or with the opportunity to create content are creating content. Right now, if you graph the lines, the content creation slope is creating it faster than certainly than the computing power to crunch it, although that's pretty fast. The storage power to store it, though again, that's pretty fast. And the connectivity power to allow it to be transmitted, which is the slowest of all of the elements here. Rick Whitt's probably right. Content will probably be created even faster than bandwidth is apportioned, and even faster than technologies allow 3G to be 4G to be 5G. But so far, if you just look at the last 5 years, the last 10 years, we've seen extraordinary possibilities. And I think the fact that we may continue to need to have more spectrum devoted to broadband services, wireless or fiber optic, licensed, unlicensed, there's so many exciting opportunities that we really ought to have policy maximize as much spectrum in the hands of the market with as few constraints as soon as possible.
Well, also during an earnings call this week, Sinclair Broadcast Group CEO David Smith said he doubted Republicans and Democrats would be able to agree on legislation for a broadcast television auction this year. Do you agree with this?
Well, first, any analyst who's banking on gridlock is hardly sticking their neck out these days. I actually don't, though. I think they're going to come to agreement on this. It's tied up with something different and bigger, the payroll tax legislation, and that's economically deemed pretty important by folks on both sides. I think they'll want to move the payroll tax relief bill, and when you move that, that has a cost. Well, nobody wants to grow deficits, and so the way you pay for the cost is, among other things, you get resources by reallocating the spectrum. So I think it's sort of hitched its wagon, the spectrum bill, to something that policymakers on both sides want to pass. It is going to require a level of comedy among lawmakers, but in the end, I think that both the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, will find a way to agree both on the payroll bill, which is the moving train, and the spectrum caboose that's attached to it.
All right, well, we'll see what happens next. Bruce, thank you so much for explaining all this to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome, and keep watching WebPro News for the very latest developments in this news. With this WebPro News report, I'm Abby Johnson.